Hi everyone. This week we're talking about results and reporting data. So basically deciding what to present and how to present it based on what the results or the findings of your research might have been. Now obviously in this class we're working on a grant proposal for research. We won't actually have any results to report. We won't have to write that section for a grant proposal. But when you go to work on your master's thesis or project in lieu of thesis, you will need to have a discussion of kind of what your findings and results of that research were. So here we go. So the results and findings section is where you report the findings of your study based upon the methodology or methodologies you applied to gather information. So the results section should state the findings of the research arranged in a logical sequence without bias or interpretation. A section describing results is particularly necessary if your paper includes data generated from your own research, which is exactly what you do in your master's project, right? The results section of an APA format paper summarizes the data that were collected, it should say, and the statistical analyses that were performed. The goal of this section is to report the results without any type of subjective interpretation. In other words, in our results section, we just give what we found. We don't tell anybody what it means. That's what we'll work on next time, okay? So here's some important features of the results section that I'll talk about in detail. So results of a study do not prove anything. Avoid providing data that is not critical to answering the research question, but do not omit relevant findings. Summarize your findings, include tables and figures, and we'll talk a little bit about page length. So here we go. Results do not prove anything. Now, many times in the news, you'll hear, right, a new study proves this, a new study proves that. Studies do not prove things. Studies, and the results section specifically, confirm or reject the hypothesis underpinning your study. In other words, the results either support or suggest that you're right, in your hypothesis, right, or they reject your hypothesis, tell you you're wrong, right? In neither case do they prove anything other than your hypothesis was accurate or inaccurate. However, the accurate articulating results does help you understand the problem from within, to break it into pieces and view the research problem from various perspectives, right? So we have these results, and the results tell us a lot of things. They suggest things. They don't prove things. Proof is a really high standard. We're talking about research. So be careful about using that word in particular. Data should focus on the research question. So when you think about your results, you may have a lot of results that you didn't anticipate that are interesting, but don't relate to the purpose of your study. So remember, everything we do in our study is driven by that purpose statement in our research questions. So when we organize our data, we want to focus on those research questions and each data point that answers that research question. So even if we have really interesting information, if it's not relevant, it shouldn't be in your results section. But do not omit relevant findings. So just as your results section should be sufficiently justifying all of your claims, it should also provide an accurate look at what you did find in your study. So be sure to mention all relevant information. Relevant's important here, right? So if your hypothesis expected more statistically significant results, do not omit the findings if they failed to support your predictions, right? So remember, results can both confirm or reject your hypotheses, right? And so if they reject them, you can't just ignore that. You still have to share that data with your audience, right? So that other researchers can either say, oh, well, look, this hypothesis is not supported, or look for a reason in your methodology that might suggest why those findings were different than you expected they would be, right? But in either case, just because they're negative results doesn't mean they're not relevant results, right? So do not ignore relevant results. Even if your study did not support your hypothesis, it does not mean that the conclusions you reach are not useful. So in our next section, we'll talk about discussion and conclusions. But right now, when you're talking about your findings, you're just telling what is the data that you found in your study that's relevant to your research questions, what you would hope to study. So while your study may not have supported your original predictions, your finding can provide important inspiration for future explorations into the topic, right? So all research is important as long as it's focused on those research questions you were asking, and that's what you present in your findings or your results section. So the work of the results section or the findings section is to summarize your findings. What did you find, right? So we're not going to include raw data. Think about this, for example. Imagine you did a quantitative study with a survey of 1,000 people. Would you include every one of those survey results? Imagine your survey had 100 questions times 1,000 people, right? That's a lot of raw data, right? So we would not include the raw data in our results section. Remember, you're summarizing the results, not reporting them in full detail. The results section should be a relatively brief overview of your findings, not a complete presentation of every single number and calculation. If you choose, you can create a supplemental online archive where other researchers can access the raw data if they choose to do so. And sometimes you can even include, just kind of pull out the most significant raw data and include it as an appendix to your piece. But the ability to put huge amounts of data online allow other researchers to work with that data to see what they can find by applying different methodologies, right? And that's why it's useful, right? If you have a huge data set, to make it available to other people. So how do we kind of summarize? What are the easiest ways to summarize? Well, using tables and figures is a great way to summarize information. And this week we'll be doing an exercise about writing with quantitative data, and next week we'll do an exercise about writing with qualitative data. So you can kind of see how you might use tables and figures differently in your writing. In fact, for your proposal this week, you'll be working on budget and timeline, both of which can be presented visually with great effect, right? So a table for your budget, right? A figure for your timeline, a chart perhaps, right? And so we want to think about how much information you can provide in a table or a figure that you can then discuss briefly because all the information is already there, right? It allows you, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a lot of times that's true. We're talking about results. So your results should include both text and illustrations. Presenting data in this way makes it easier for readers to quickly look at your results. Structure your results section around tables or figures that summarize the results of your statistical analysis. In many cases, the easiest way to accomplish this is to first create your tables and figures and then organize them in a logical way. Next, write the summary text to support your illustrative materials, right? In other words, your research questions ask different things, and different parts of your study, different results from your study, speak directly to those. So if you take those that speak to each research question and put those together in a summary table or figure, put those in the order of the research questions you want to discuss, then all you do is go back and describe in text then what your findings are. So do not include tables and figures if you are not going to talk about them in the body of your results section. Remember, you only include information you're going to talk about, the information that's relevant. And do not present the same data twice in your illustrative materials, right? So maybe you have a chart or a graph or a table that provides information that speaks to two of your findings, or that includes findings that speak to two research questions. You do not represent that information. Instead, you would, in your text, point back to that table or figure so that people could not have to see the same chart or graph twice, but instead would just be able to go back and reference it, right? Same thing, right? If you present your data in a table, don't then put a graph or a figure, right? Or, you know, sometimes we'll see things where it says, here are the raw numbers, and then here they are in some kind of visual depiction, right? Maybe a bar graph or a circle graph or something like that. You don't need to do that. Instead, you should choose the presentation that most clearly answers your research question, and you can provide the alternative explanation in text, because we don't want to provide the same information twice in visual form. So notes on the length of a results section. Results sections are typically pretty short. They're focused very much on just giving, here's what the data that I collected, right? It doesn't say anything about what that data means. It just says, here's the data, okay? So the page length of this section is set by the amount and types of data to be reported. If you have one research question, you just have one set of results. If you have 5 research questions, it's going to be longer because you need sets of results for each of those questions. Does that make sense, I hope? So be concise, using non-textual elements appropriately, such as figures and tables, to present findings more efficiently, right? Once again, that's that idea of having a chart or a visual presentation can provide a lot more information more concisely than having to explain each individual piece of data and their relationship to the other data that you're discussing. In deciding what data to describe in your results section, you must clearly distinguish information that would be normally included in a research paper from any raw data or content that would be included as an appendix, right? So not all your raw data goes in there, just the data that matters. And it should go in there in a way that speaks to your research question. In general, raw data that has not been summarized should not be included in the main text of your paper unless requested to do so by your professor. So obviously in your classes, you want to make sure you meet the requirements of the assignment. Always assume that your readers have a solid understanding of statistical concepts. There's no need to explain what a t-test is or how a one-way ANOVA works. And if you don't know what those things are, that's okay. Eventually, if you take a methods class, that's where you'll learn about, especially these more complex, or a statistics class, right? These more complex analysis tools. But here in your results section, you don't have to talk about that, right? If you have a really unusual statistical concept that you're applying, that's something you describe in your methods section. Here, you're just reporting the results. Your responsibility is to report the results of your study, not to teach your readers how to analyze or interpret statistics. The Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association recommends including effect sizes, that is the scope of your study, right? So in your results section, so readers can appreciate the importance of your study's findings. So effect sizes are another thing that you'll talk about if you take a statistics class, but the idea is basically how many pieces of data were available and how they represent or don't represent a larger population and what that larger population looks like. So in other words, how applicable to other situations are my results, right? So if I have results in one classroom, are those results applicable to the whole school, to the whole district, to the whole state, to the nation, or to the world, right? To all classrooms across the world. Well, if you're talking about one classroom setting, your findings might be very specific to that particular setting, right? So having some mention of how many people, which we talked about in participants, right? But what our actual data says and how it can be generalized. And the reason you talk about effect sizes is because then in your discussion, in your conclusion, you'll be talking about room for additional study, right? So what are some things that, based on our results, we know and don't know, and part of that is effect sizes. For most research papers in the social and behavioral sciences, there are 2 possible ways of organizing the results. Hopefully you've seen this as you've read different studies. Both approaches are appropriate in how you report your findings, but use only one format, so don't try to squeeze these both together. So one way is kind of present a synopsis of the results followed by an explanation of key findings. This approach can be used to highlight important findings. For example, you may have noticed an unusual correlation between 2 variables during the analysis of your finding. It's appropriate to point out this in the results section. However, speculating as to why this correlation exists and offering a hypothesis about what may be happening belongs in the discussion section, right? So here's the idea, right, of this approach. You kind of give an overview of all your findings, right, a quick summary, and then you provide more detailed results for your key findings, right? Those things that are really useful and really answer your research questions. Or you can present a result, then explain it before presenting the next result, then explaining it, and so on, and end with a synopsis. So the same idea happens, right? It's the question is whether you want to have a lot of kind of front loading, here's an overview of my results, or if you want to start with the results and then provide that big overview. Just as a literature review should be arranged under conceptual categories rather than systematically describing each source, organize your findings under key themes related to addressing the research problem, right? So hopefully you're going to see this alignment as you're working, where your literature review has themes. Those themes are tied to your research questions and your purpose statement, and those things are then tied to your methodology, and then those things are answered in your results, right? So we see this coherence, that is the things that go together, that relate logically, right? From each section. So in my introduction section, these are the important ideas, right, that I see in the literature that are my research questions related to this topic, right? This is the method that is designed to search for these things. These are the results, is what I found about these things, right? And then we get to our discussion and conclusion. This is what we now know about these things. So hopefully you're starting to see how these key themes that you're uncovering are going to persist through your work, because your work's focused on that central research question. So when you think about the contents of the results section, kind of a big overview, here's one way to think about it. You have to have some kind of introductory context for understanding the results by restating the research problem and underpinning your study, right? This is useful in reorientating the reader's focus back to the research problem after reading a literature review and your explanation of the methods and data gathering of analysis, right? So it's always a good idea for each new section to kind of connect that section to what's come before, to tell us how it fits into the big study and why it matters. Inclusion of non-textual elements, so we talked, right, using figures, charts, photos, maps, tables, etc. to further illustrate key findings if appropriate. A systematic description of your results, highlighting for the reader observations that are most relevant to the topic under investigation. Not all results emerge from methodology used to gather information may be related to answering the so what question, right? So if we're sharing information, it should be so what? How does this connect to our research proposal, our research problem, right? Do not confuse observations with interpretations, right? Observations are highlighting important findings you discovered through a process of reviewing prior literature and gathering data. Interpretations are what comes in the next section. That's when you tell us what they mean, okay? The page length of the results section is guided by the amount and types of data reported, right? And then a short paragraph that concludes the results section by synthesizing key findings of the study. So this is kind of where you highlight the most important findings, because that's kind of setting up your discussion where you're going to discuss those most important findings and why they matter. So here's a couple more tips for writing a results section. The results section should be written in the past tense, right? It's something that's already done. These are my findings. This is what we found in past tense, right? Focus on being concise and objective, right? Get to the point. Don't make it all flowery. Say, this is what we found. This is what it looks like. This is what it is. Not this is what it means. You can always visit the library and read journal articles. Of course, you can do that online, right? To pay attention to how other authors present results of their research. One of the best things that you can do, and something I've started talking about since the beginning of this class, is that reading research, right, to see what other people do and how other people do it, can help you be a better research writer yourself. And then finally, remember the results section of your paper is all about simply providing the data from your study. This section is often the shortest part of your paper and in most cases the most clinical. Be sure not to include any subjective interpretation of the results. Simply relay the data in the most objective and straightforward way possible. You can then provide your own analysis of what these results mean in the discussion section of your paper, which we'll talk about next week. So here are some problems to avoid. When writing the results section, avoid doing the following. Avoid discussing or interpreting your results, right? So that goes in the next section. Avoid reporting background information or attempting to explain your findings. You should have the background in your introduction, and you should have the explanations in your discussion. Avoid ignoring negative results. Remember, negative results sometimes matter a lot. Avoid including raw data or intermediate calculations. This results section is not about how you compiled your data or what all those data were. Instead, it's a summary of the important findings. Avoid being vague or non-specific, right? Get to the point. Avoid kind of wandering things like appeared to be greater than other variables or demonstrates promising trends that. Just say, what did it find? Presenting the same data or repeating the same information more than once, right? Just provide your information clearly and straightforwardly, and then we will be able to see your results, right? Later you can discuss them in more detail. And don't confuse figures and tables. And that's important because APA asks you to label figures and tables separately. And so if you're not clear what's the difference between a table and a figure, you should definitely look that up. I'll see about posting some information in the course about that as well. All right, any questions, send me an email. I'm here to help. Take care.